18 months ago, the political picture looked very different. Inside the Oval Office, Donald Trump famously confronted Volodymyr Zelensky and questioned Ukraine's leverage, making it clear that, in his view, Kyiv had already played most of the cards in its hand. But war has a strange way of changing the value of those cards. Since then, Ukraine has gone through an extraordinary transformation. It is no longer simply a country receiving weapons from its allies. It is increasingly becoming a country that develops, manufactures, and exports weapons to those same allies. And that transformation has now produced a development with potentially enormous consequences. Ukraine has reportedly supplied the United States with 2,000 F-10 attack drones. If this development continues at scale, it could represent something much bigger than a conventional arms transaction. It could mark the beginning of a completely different relationship between Washington and Kyiv. For years, the military relationship was overwhelmingly one-directional. American weapons went to Ukraine. American money went to Ukraine. American intelligence and military assistance supported Ukraine. But now, the flow is beginning to move in another direction. Ukraine is sending battlefield-tested technology to America. And that changes the political equation. Because the country that was once described as dependent on Western military assistance is now offering the Pentagon something it urgently needs: inexpensive, rapidly deployable combat drones shaped by direct experience on one of the world's most intense modern battlefields. That is where the real story begins. The drone that changes the equation. The F-10 is described as a compact FPV attack drone built around the philosophy that has transformed warfare in Ukraine. It is not a giant aircraft. It is not an expensive strategic bomber. It does not require a massive runway or a complicated logistics chain. Instead, it is small, agile, relatively inexpensive, and designed to be operated close to the battlefield. Its purpose is simple. Find the target. Guide the drone toward it. And strike. That makes it particularly useful against armored vehicles, military equipment, fortified positions, and personnel. But there is another characteristic that makes the reported American acquisition especially significant. The system is said to contain no Chinese origin components. That matters because Washington has increasingly tightened the rules surrounding the components entering sensitive American defense systems. A drone that can satisfy those requirements while remaining inexpensive and combat-proven is extremely attractive to the Pentagon. And Ukraine has something that many defense industries do not possess. Years of continuous battlefield experimentation. Every month of the war has produced new lessons about drone range, electronic warfare, communications, targeting, battery technology, payloads, countermeasures, and operator tactics. The battlefield has effectively become a gigantic laboratory. Ukraine has been learning from it in real time. Why America needs cheap drones. The timing is also important. Modern American warfare has traditionally depended heavily on highly sophisticated and extraordinarily expensive weapons systems. An MQ-9 Reaper, for example, can cost tens of millions of dollars. That creates an obvious problem. You do not want to spend tens of millions of dollars every time you need to neutralize a target that may itself be worth a fraction of that amount. The war in the Middle East has reinforced this problem. Reports cited in the original account claim that American forces lost at least 24 MQ-9 Reaper drones between February and April 2026. Producing losses approaching the billion-dollar range when the value of the aircraft and associated systems is considered. Whether every figure is ultimately confirmed or not, the strategic lesson is clear. America needs a cheaper layer of warfare. Something disposable. Something numerous. Something that can be lost without creating a strategic crisis. And this is precisely where small FPV drones become attractive. If a drone costing only hundreds or a few $1,000s can destroy a vehicle, strike a firing position, or eliminate a battlefield target worth millions, the economics become extremely difficult to ignore. The Pentagon does not necessarily need another expensive aircraft. Sometimes it needs thousands of cheap aircraft. F-10 versus Shahed. This becomes even clearer when the Ukrainian system is compared with Iran's Shahed family. The two technologies represent fundamentally different approaches. The Shahed 136 is essentially a long-range strike weapon. It can travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers and carry a substantially larger warhead. Its purpose is to attack infrastructure and strategic targets at long distances. The F-10 operates in a completely different category. Its effective range is much shorter. Its payload is smaller. But it has one major advantage. A human operator can continue controlling the aircraft during the final stage of the attack. That means the operator can react to movement. If an armored vehicle changes direction, the drone can follow it. If a target moves behind an obstacle, the operator can adjust. This is not simply a missile flying toward predetermined coordinates. It is a human-guided weapon operating inside the tactical battle space. And that distinction matters enormously. The Shahed is designed to travel far. The FPV drone is designed to strike precisely. One represents strategic reach. The other represents tactical flexibility. The economic war in the sky. Then comes the most important factor of all, price. Iranian Shahed-type drones are considerably more expensive than the smallest FPV systems. Ukraine's drone industry has demonstrated that thousands of relatively simple attack drones can be manufactured at a fraction of the cost of traditional aircraft. This creates an entirely different military equation. Imagine an opponent firing $1 million interceptor at a drone that costs only a few hundred or a few $1,000s. That exchange may be necessary. But it is economically unsustainable if repeated indefinitely. This is why the future of warfare may increasingly depend on what military planners call attritable systems. Weapons that are powerful enough to matter, cheap enough to lose, and numerous enough to overwhelm an enemy. And Washington appears increasingly interested in exactly that concept. The Pentagon's drone-focused procurement plans reportedly include around $1.1 billion aimed at expanding America's access to low-cost unmanned systems, with ambitions to acquire more than 200,000 attack drones by 2027. That number is staggering. But it raises another question. Where will all those drones come from? Ukraine's industrial gamble. Ukraine believes it can play a major role. Despite fighting a major war, the country has rapidly expanded its drone manufacturing sector. The Ukrainian defense industry is reportedly targeting production of between 6 and 7 million attack drones during 2026. That is an extraordinary figure. The country's ability to produce hundreds of thousands of drones every month has transformed the meaning of Ukrainian military assistance. Ukraine is no longer simply asking, "What weapons can America send us?" It can increasingly ask, "What technology can we build for America?" And that is a fundamentally different relationship. The reported plan for F-drones to establish an $18.4 million production facility in Ohio makes this even more significant. Instead of Ukraine simply shipping finished products across the Atlantic, Ukrainian technology could become embedded directly inside the American defense industrial system. That creates jobs in America. It expands production capacity. It gives Ukraine access to American capital and supply chains. And it gives Washington direct access to Ukrainian battlefield expertise. The relationship becomes mutually beneficial. Zelensky's new card. This may ultimately be the most important consequence. Ukraine's political leverage is no longer based solely on the amount of military assistance it receives. It can increasingly be based on what it contributes. That is a major shift. Imagine the difference between an ally saying, "We need your weapons," and an ally saying, "We have technology that your military wants." Those are completely different negotiating positions. For Zelensky, the second position is far more powerful. And it could become particularly important when dealing with Donald Trump. Trump has repeatedly emphasized deals, economic value, burden sharing, and tangible benefits. A military partnership in which Ukraine provides useful technology to the American defense industry fits much more naturally into that framework than a relationship defined entirely by American financial assistance. Ukraine can therefore present itself not simply as a recipient of American support, but as a strategic partner capable of contributing to America's own military modernization. That is a powerful political message. The Patriot and missile question. And this is where the drone deal could potentially become something much bigger. Ukraine desperately needs air defense ammunition. The Patriot system remains one of its most important tools against Russian missiles and aircraft. But American stocks have also come under pressure because of demands elsewhere, including the Middle East. If Washington faces shortages of certain interceptor missiles, Ukraine has an incentive to negotiate from a position of technological value. The argument becomes simple. Ukraine provides drone technology and production capacity. America provides access to critical military systems and ammunition. That could potentially include additional Patriot interceptors. It could also reopen discussions surrounding longer-range American weapons and other advanced munitions. Nothing about such exchanges is automatic. But the strategic principle is important. Military technology can become a bargaining chip. And Ukraine now possesses more of those chips than it did 18 months ago. Moscow's worst-case scenario. For Moscow, this development creates an uncomfortable possibility. Russia's strategy has long relied heavily on its ability to outproduce and outlast Ukraine. If Ukraine's defense industry becomes increasingly integrated with American capital, technology, and procurement, the equation changes. Russia would no longer be fighting only Ukrainian production. It would increasingly be confronting a Ukrainian industrial sector connected directly to Western defense markets. That means every American contract could potentially strengthen Ukrainian manufacturing. Every new factory could increase production. Every battlefield innovation could be tested and commercialized. And every successful export could generate additional revenue for Ukraine. The reported arrangement under which 20% of revenues from such contracts would go directly to the Ukrainian state would make the economic implications even more significant. For Moscow, the nightmare scenario is therefore not simply that Ukraine receives another batch of drones. It is that Ukraine permanently embeds itself inside the Western defense industrial ecosystem. That would make the country's separation from Russia's traditional sphere of influence increasingly irreversible. But Russia is not standing still. Moscow understands the importance of this race. Russia is also attempting to dramatically increase FPV drone production. Its reported target for 2026 is more than 7 million systems. And Russian engineers are adapting quickly. One of their most important developments involves fiber-optic-controlled drones. Instead of relying entirely on radio communications, these drones use physical fiber-optic cables to maintain control. That gives them an enormous advantage in environments saturated with electronic warfare. Traditional radio-controlled drones can be jammed. A fiber-optic drone is far more resistant to that type of interference. But the technology comes with its own weakness. The cable remains physically attached to the drone. In forests, urban areas, and environments filled with obstacles, that cable can become a serious limitation. Ukraine's traditional FPV systems, meanwhile, remain free to maneuver without a physical tether. The contest therefore continues. One side has resilience against electronic warfare. The other has greater physical freedom. And the battlefield will determine which advantage matters more. Russia's next generation. Russia is also exploring faster attack drones and new propulsion systems. The reported development of jet-powered versions of Iranian-designed Garand drones is part of a broader effort to reduce reaction times and make interception more difficult. The objective is obvious. Fly faster. Reach the target sooner. Give defenders less time to react. This demonstrates an important reality of modern warfare. Every drone innovation immediately creates a countermeasure. Every countermeasure generates another innovation. The result is an accelerating technological cycle. Ukraine develops a new system. Russia adapts. Ukraine modifies its tactics. Russia changes its electronics. And the process begins again. Then there is China. But the biggest long-term challenge may not come from Russia. It may come from China. Beijing is approaching drone warfare from a very different direction. Rather than focusing only on small tactical drones, Chinese military engineers are exploring large platforms capable of carrying and deploying swarms of smaller unmanned aircraft. The reported 16-ton drone carrier known as the GJ-11, or similar concepts described in Chinese military research, illustrates the basic idea. One large platform enters the battle space. It releases dozens or even more than 100 smaller drones. Those drones then overwhelm enemy defenses through numbers. This is swarm warfare. And it represents a completely different philosophy from the Ukrainian FPV model. Ukraine's approach emphasizes decentralization. Small teams. Small drones. Low cost. Rapid deployment. China is exploring concentration. Large carriers. Large swarms. Networked systems. Mass simultaneous attacks. The American acquisition of Ukrainian FPV technology therefore has significance beyond the war in Ukraine. Washington is learning from Ukraine how relatively inexpensive unmanned systems can operate at the lowest tactical level. That knowledge could eventually become valuable in a completely different conflict. The future battlefield. Consider what this means. A traditional military might once have asked, how many tanks do we have? How many fighter jets? How many missiles? How many ships? The future military planner may ask different questions. How many autonomous systems can we deploy? How quickly can we replace them? How resistant are they to jamming? How intelligent are their targeting systems? How much does each system cost? And how many enemy weapons must be used to stop them? That is a profound change. The most expensive weapon does not necessarily win. The weapon that creates the best exchange ratio may win. And that is the lesson Ukraine has learned through years of continuous combat. Ukraine's transformation. This is why the reported F-10 transfer matters far beyond the number 2000. The drones themselves are not the entire story. The real story is the relationship they represent. Ukraine is attempting to transform itself from a battlefield dependent on Western weapons into a battlefield laboratory capable of supplying Western militaries with new technology. That changes Kiev's position in Washington. It changes Ukraine's economic model. It changes the country's defense industry. And potentially, it changes the diplomatic balance surrounding any future peace negotiations. Zelensky could enter such negotiations not merely as the leader of a country asking the West for continued assistance. He could enter as the leader of a country whose defense technology is becoming increasingly useful to the West. That distinction could matter enormously. The peace table. Imagine a future negotiation involving Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and Europe. Russia wants territorial concessions. Ukraine wants security guarantees. America wants an agreement that ends the war without creating another endless military commitment. Under that scenario, Ukraine's new defense-industrial relationship with Washington could become another layer of leverage. Kiev could argue that abandoning Ukraine would not simply mean reducing aid. It could disrupt an emerging American-Ukrainian defense partnership that benefits the United States itself. That does not make Ukraine invincible. It does not guarantee American support forever. And it certainly does not mean Washington has become dependent on a single Ukrainian drone. But it changes the conversation. The relationship is becoming increasingly reciprocal. And reciprocal relationships are generally harder to abandon than purely one-sided aid arrangements. A new military order. The larger historical lesson may be even more important. For decades, the world's strongest militaries were defined by massive platforms. Aircraft carriers. Fighter jets. Main battle tanks. Long-range missiles. Strategic bombers. Those systems remain extremely important. But another layer of warfare is emerging beneath them. Millions of inexpensive drones. Autonomous platforms. AI-assisted targeting. Electronic warfare. Swarming systems. Rapid battlefield manufacturing. And weapons that can be designed, tested, modified, and redeployed in months rather than decades. Ukraine has been forced to develop this ecosystem faster than almost any other modern military. Now Washington wants access to that experience. Russia wants to defeat it. China wants to surpass it. And Europe is watching closely. That makes Ukraine much more than a battlefield. It is becoming a testing ground for the future of warfare. The questions that now matter. So the biggest question is no longer simply whether Ukraine can survive. The question is whether Ukraine can turn wartime innovation into long-term strategic power. Could American demand encourage more NATO countries to purchase Ukrainian military technology? Could Ukrainian companies become permanent suppliers to Western defense industries? Could battlefield experience become one of Ukraine's most valuable exports? And perhaps most importantly, could the rise of cheap autonomous systems fundamentally change how future wars are fought? Because if that happens, then the value of a country may no longer be determined solely by how many traditional weapons it possesses. It may be determined by how quickly it can innovate, how cheaply it can manufacture, how rapidly it can adapt, and how effectively it can turn battlefield experience into technology. 18 months ago, Ukraine was being told that its cards were running out. Today, the picture looks considerably more complicated. The country is still fighting for survival. It still depends heavily on Western support. But it is also developing something that could become just as important as foreign aid. The ability to create military technology that the world's most powerful armies themselves want. And if the reported F-10 transfer is only the beginning, then the real story may not be about 2,000 drones at all. It may be about the birth of a new military-industrial partnership between Kiev and Washington, and about how that partnership could reshape the balance of power far beyond Ukraine. The next great military revolution may not arrive on the wings of a billion-dollar aircraft. It may arrive in millions of small drones, built cheaply, launched quickly, and controlled by soldiers who learned their lessons on the world's most unforgiving battlefield. The age of mass, intelligent, expendable warfare may already be here.